So when you ask consumers why they aren't buying EVs, cost aside, because by now EVs were supposed to be cheaper than comparable internal combustion engine vehicles. But China controls 80-90% of all the raw minerals that go into batteries. They made investments 15-20 years ago. And as a result, I think we're going to have a hard time getting the cost of batteries down over time. Right now, something like 40% to 50% of the vehicle you buy is the battery itself. And I don't know that's going to come down over time. But I like to think of the reasons why consumers resist EVs as a triangle, 3 points on a triangle. And those are the range itself, the charging infrastructure availability, and then the time to charge. And if any of those three are reduced or optimized, then the resistance can start to collapse. If we can get production cars that can do 1,000 miles on one charge, if you can be certain that there's going to be chargers on every single corner and available chargers and they're working, and the electrical grid isn't going to melt, and then finally, the time to charge. You can have less frequent chargers if you can charge a vehicle in 5 minutes. And there's a lot of innovation going on all three of those things. But until we see significant progress, I think there's still going to be a lot of resistance to EV adoption, specifically in the US, but I think also globally.
Como podem ver, os últimos anos foram dos mais animados de sempre no setor automóvel. Novos segmentos, novos modelos de negócio, novas tecnologias e muitas tendências à espera de confirmação por parte dos mercados e, claro, também por parte do consumidor. Caso para questionar, que futuro para o setor automóvel? Com mais de 20 anos como Autotech Corporate Leader, 5 anos como Autotech Entrepreneur e responsável por uma das publicações mais citadas no setor automóvel e de mobilidade, Steve Greenfield, CEO e fundador da Automotive Ventures nos Estados Unidos da América, é o convidado que se segue e irá partilhar connosco algum do seu conhecimento. Dizer que estão previstas questões no final, 10 minutos para questões, que podem ser feitas tanto em português como em inglês, ou seja, estão à vontade para colocar as vossas questões das duas formas. Agora sim, deem as boas-vindas a Steve Greenfield.
Well, thank you very much, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today. And this is the first time I've done this with a live translator. So if for whatever reason I'm speaking too quickly, I'll take a signal from you and just let me know. But it is an honor to be here today. So let me start with a little housekeeping. I will send out this presentation to anyone who wants it. I'll set my contact information at the end of the presentation, but feel free to reach out to me either via LinkedIn or to my email, and we'll make sure we get you a copy of the presentation. My journey started in Toronto, so I'm from Canada originally. So if there's a translation problem, it might not only be with English, but you might hear my Canadian accent as well. And I did make the move down to the US about 21 years ago when I started within automotive. And I've now had the chance to work for the largest B2B wholesale auction company in the world, Manheim, headquartered in Atlanta. And then I moved over to what was at the time the largest classified marketplace in the world, AutoTrader, and had a chance to oversee acquisitions and strategy there. If you fast forward to current day, for the last 3 years, we've launched now 2 venture funds. So I find myself at this point in my career actually deploying money and investing in early stage automotive, technology, and mobility companies from around the globe. So as a result, we probably see 50 to 60 new companies every month that reach out to us looking for funding, very, very early stage, from every single area across the globe, which is an exciting place to be. So I'm going to try to convince you today, which I don't think is going to be hard given this audience because you're living this change, that we will see more change in this industry in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last 100. And you saw as evidence in that video, A lot of the way that we've sold and serviced vehicles for the last 100 years has stayed pretty stagnant, except the internet 25 years ago, which really changed where eyeballs chased content, pricing content, inventory content, sales content. But the vast majority of the transactions are still taking place face-to-face at dealerships, and that is quickly evolving. And there's a lot of interest from the manufacturers themselves, the automakers, to make that change even quicker, as we'll talk today about themes like selling directly and a shift away from the franchise model to more of an agency model. So what are the themes affecting automotive? And again, I don't have to sell you on this because you're living through these, but I would group them into four different groups. So first, in the upper left-hand corner, you've really got consumers' expectations changing, not so much within automotive, but outside of automotive. So we'll talk about categories. We heard from the gentleman from Vorten earlier today, and the expectations for consumers around convenience and sacrificing price discovery for convenience is changing their attitudes, consumers, especially younger consumers, as they come in and potentially buy their first vehicle. The transparency that the internet brought really compressed profit margins, specifically on the profit margin for new and used vehicles. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. I think that coming out of COVID, car dealerships will continue to be an environment where profit margins will be compressed. All the more reason to look at new software solutions like we saw earlier today with MarketView to help look at velocity, the turn time of vehicles, because it's going to become increasingly hard from a margin standpoint. In the lower left-hand corner, we've got electrification. We've heard a lot today about electrification. I'll talk about electrification too. Not only the momentum that electrification has, but some of the potential resistance that we're going to feel from consumers as well. So we should take a balanced view, and we'll talk a little bit about why many of the manufacturers have proclaimed they're going to go 100% EV. I'm doubtful we'll get there, because I think there will continue to be a healthy segment of consumers that continue to want to buy internal combustion engine vehicles. Well, in the upper right-hand corner, we'll talk about the manufacturers themselves moving in many countries towards an agency model, the intent to sell directly to consumers and own and control more of that consumer experience. And then finally, we'll talk about the vehicle technology itself, which is one of the more fascinating areas, including autonomous driving, the complexity of the technology that we're building into these vehicles. But then, interestingly enough, despite the fact that the car is getting more complex, at the same time they're being built better, and the actual holding time of those vehicles is longer. So we'll dive into all of these, and at the end of this, I want to provide you a practical framework that you can take back for your business to make sense of all of these themes and which ones are most likely to affect your business, and you can then thus prioritize your strategy accordingly. So let me make one observation before we look into the future. If I went back in time to when I started in automotive, which was 22 years ago, I would say I could very clearly describe each of these four silos to you. And with the last couple of years, it's becoming increasingly hard, because what's happening is these silos are breaking down. There's a blurring of the lines of definition between each of these categories. What is a dealership when you've got online players like Carvana or Kazoo? What is an OEM? The OEM used to wholesale vehicles to dealers, and now many more OEMs are emerging that have a new model where they sell directly to consumers. And even the evolution of the marketplace. The marketplace in many cases, and in certain countries, is starting to own the vehicle. We're seeing that in the UK, we've seen that in the US. So the marketplace, which used to be an advertising medium for car dealers and manufacturers, in some cases also is taking a principal position in actually the ownership of the vehicle. So the whole landscape is becoming very opaque in terms of these clear definitions between the market players. So let's look into the crystal ball and look towards the future. And one of my favorite quotes about the future, and it's often cited, is from a futurist named William Gibson. And the reason that I like this quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed," is that if we observe keenly these little seeds, we can anticipate which of those seeds will become a plant, which will become a tree over time. These seeds are already amongst us. We just have to have a keen sense of observation to see which ones and anticipate which ones will grow into trees. So I have a book, and I'm happy to send the book to anybody who would like a copy. So it is in English. I have not translated it to Portuguese, but maybe somebody can help me. But I've got a book that came out 6 months ago, and the perspective is on the future of automotive. I think that's why I was asked to be here today. So what I will do for the remainder of the presentation today is talk through the 8 areas of the book. So if you pick up the book, you can get an audio version if you want to hear my voice for 6.5 hours. After today, you might not want to do that. But I do go through all of these thematic areas in much more detail in the book, and I'm happy to hop on a call anytime to have a conversation about these areas. But let me talk about each of these 8 areas very briefly. So first, about the relationship between manufacturer and dealer. It's changing very quickly. And we've seen evidence of this both in Europe and in the US recently, with many more of the OEMs starting to establish a relationship directly with a consumer. Consumer goes to the automaker's website, they might reserve the vehicle in advance, the dealer becomes a distribution point to drop off the vehicle, but slowly but surely, many of the manufacturers are pulling away some of the opportunity for the consumer to interact with that dealer during the shopping and the purchasing process. And we will see this trend continue. In the US, there are franchise laws we'll talk about that protect the dealer much more so than in other areas of the world, like in Europe. What the manufacturers are doing as they release new electric vehicles is they're forcing the dealers to make choices. In this case, the Ford dealers, there are 3,000 Ford dealers in the US, all had to make a choice to say, do you want to only sell internal combustion engine vehicles? If you want to sell EVs, electric vehicles, you have to make significant facility upgrades, $500,000 or $1 million, to be able to participate in the sale of EVs. And many dealers just don't have the economic wherewithal to be able to make these investments. So there will be this new future where some of the dealers are left behind, can only sell internal combustion engine vehicles, and there'll be a subsegment of dealers in the future that will be enabled to sell EVs based on their ability to step up from a financial standpoint. We're seeing some OEMs, in this case Volkswagen, launch new products. This is a new line called Scout, which is an EV sport utility vehicle, SUV. And when they launch this, they will go directly to, it's owned by Volkswagen wholly, but they will go directly to the consumer and probably won't have a dealer network. And there's been a lot of pushback in the US because the existing Volkswagen dealers wonder, how can Volkswagen launch a new brand and not have the dealers participate? But you're going to see more evidence of this globally as well. And this is something for all dealers, whether you're a new car dealer or a used car dealer, to pay attention to. Ford has announced in the US that at the end of the lease term, the consumer will no longer have the opportunity to buy the vehicle. So they're turning the regular 3-year leases into more of a subscription product where the consumer won't have the right to buy the vehicle at the end, which means the manufacturers are going to start to control used car inventory for leases. And then they'll be able to figure out where they want to provide those vehicles to, which types of dealers. And it's probably going to be the dealers that they make kingmaker, that they are willing to step up and make more investments in their facilities. So things are changing very quickly. Let's look at Europe. 6 months ago, Stellantis terminated the franchise agreements with all of their dealerships in Europe. I'm sure many are represented in the room today. And they signaled or communicated with dealers that as of June of this year, 2023, those franchise agreements would be replaced with agency agreements. And the main differences are that the OEM, in this case Stellantis, is going to control the inventory and take the inventory risk and conduct the marketing. So pulling away the inventory and pulling away the marketing from the dealer. They still want the dealers to exist because they want this to be a distribution point for the delivery of the car that's sold. but they are, and they want the dealer to service these vehicles, but the friction, right, the tension between the manufacturers who want to control more of the experience with the consumer and the dealers will continue, and is continuing at an accelerated pace outside of the US, because as I said earlier, the US has very protective franchise laws that protects those dealers for the time being. Stellantis believes they can cut 50% of the distribution costs by being more efficient. Many of these automakers are looking at Tesla's financials and saying, Tesla is much more efficient, they can make more profit per vehicle, and we want to mimic what Tesla is doing, capture more of the value chain. So they've got consultants working with the manufacturers to say, if you are able to control more of the experience directly, you can take out costs and be more profitable. And this is a lot of what's driving this change with the OEM and dealership relationship. Mercedes has done the same thing. They're looking at shrinking the footprint by 10 or 15% globally. And there is pushback, however. There's an interesting case, if you aren't observing this, you should be observing this, in Australia, both for Mercedes and for Honda. In this case, Mercedes did make the transition from a franchise model to an agency model 5 years ago. And more than half of the Mercedes stores in Australia are now suing Mercedes. They've taken them to court and there's a lawsuit. Their argument is that transition from a franchise model to an agency model was misrepresented, and there have been dire financial consequences to the Mercedes dealerships as well. This has not been resolved yet, but I think the world is watching to see how in the Australian courts this gets settled, because it may set some precedent for how things play out in other countries. And, the foremost philosopher of our time, Mike Tyson, as he said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. I think that what the automakers, and with all due respect to the automakers that are in the audience today, are operating at a very theoretical level. I think the first quarter, where they're reporting to an analyst, a financial analyst, and have to report that on their balance sheet, they're backing up new cars, and they have to take a huge write down of those assets that are depreciating. I think that'll be when there's a day of reckoning. And I think that they have a great idea, but I think in theory, probably we will come back to more of a franchise model. I think long term, the manufacturers won't have the aptitude or appetite, I should say, to keep that inventory on their balance sheets. So let's move on to the convenience economy. We heard from the gentleman from Vorten this morning, sort of the Amazon of Portugal. I think this gentleman, who was recently the wealthiest man on earth, he was superseded by Elon Musk for a short time, although with Tesla stock price, that may be switching back sometime soon. But he single-handedly has reset expectations for consumers. And the interesting thing about Amazon, if you're an Amazon Prime customer in the US, is there's this trade-off between what I would call price discovery, price realization, and convenience. So there's 167 million Amazon Prime customers that pay for next day delivery, pay a premium for that. And it's very, very hard when you're on Amazon. I don't know what the Vorten consumer experience is like, but it's very, very hard now to shop for a product on Amazon and have certainty that you're getting the lowest price. I think we're conditioning a younger generation of shoppers to not negotiate. When you look at, I see, I'm getting to speak slowly, please, so let me slow down a little bit. When you look at large product categories in the US for new products where you still negotiate price, what are they? Automobiles, I would say mattresses that you sleep on, and then furniture. Typically, those are the three product categories in the U.S. And I think the younger generation isn't going to have any interest in negotiating any longer. I don't know how things are here in Portugal, but the younger generation doesn't like confrontation. They don't like to have face-to-face interactions, period. Everything's through devices. And I do think that there's a future for future generation where we may sell every single vehicle without negotiation, which can be a great thing for manufacturers and for dealers because sites like Amazon are training the next generation of consumers not to negotiate. Tesla has largely followed Amazon's lead. They provide a beautiful consumer experience around buying the vehicle. Where they fall down is the servicing of the vehicle. So you hear these horror stories about servicing vehicles. And then Carvana in the US and Cazoo in the UK are literally it's like a train wreck you're watching in slow motion. They're both literally imploding in real time. And they've built up these massive cost structures with the anticipation that they could squeeze out a lot of gross profit per unit sold for used vehicles, and it just hasn't played out. And there may be questions about Carvana and Cazoo, but really the short answer is that they built in these extra costs to go pick up the vehicle from the consumer's driveway and deliver the vehicle to the consumer's driveway. And those extra costs just break the financial model. If you had to do that for your businesses, it's likely you wouldn't turn a profit either. And they both bet, both Carvana and Cazoo, that they would get the national scale, and at some point in the future, they would become profitable. And they sold that to the financial markets, but it just has not materialized. And as they say in the US, the chickens have come home to roost, I think, with these business models. And it's, I don't know that either one of them survives, at least not in the current model that they have today. So let's talk about the crazy man, who I believe he may be the second wealthiest man on earth because he's imploding with this purchase of Twitter. And it's very interesting to see, very, very smart, but I think at the same time very crazy. What he's done in the US is he's attacking these franchise laws that protect the dealers. And in blue and in green states, he's able to sell directly to consumers. In the red states, we still have these protective franchise laws that are protecting the dealerships. He cannot sell directly in those states. But one by one, slowly, they'll knock these things down, and then the US will look more like the rest of the world, where they aren't these protective state franchise laws. But behind Tesla has come Rivian, Lucid, and other direct OEMs, Polestar, for example, that now don't have these restrictions in the US and can sell directly. So the other OEMs are selling directly, achieving in some cases higher profit margins, and this is what's sparking the legacy OEMs, the legacy automakers to look at those business models and say, can we capture more profit if we start selling directly to consumers as well? And this is causing the tension between automakers and with dealers. And one final note on Amazon. I believe it's inevitable that eventually Amazon will offer vehicles for sale. They've struggled with this in the US for 10 or 12 years, but it's too large a product category for them to ignore. So at some point, we will have vehicles offered on sites like Amazon. I don't know if Vorten is going to offer vehicles as well, but I would suspect, at least when they talk strategy, they likely spend time thinking like, how do they get into this product category? And is there an opportunity for them to get into this product category? It's just too large for any of these marketplaces to ignore. Okay, let's talk about vehicle ownership. So this is a nice short section because I would say that the subscription models, these monthly subscription models, have almost all failed. And why do companies fail with these subscription models is largely vehicle depreciation. So there's this adage in the US that a used car, the new car becomes a used car the moment you drive it off of the dealer's lot. And there's like 10%, 15% depreciation immediately. That doesn't reconcile with allowing the consumer to switch in and out of a car on a monthly basis as frequently as they want, because the vehicles depreciate so much. When you look at the term of the average lease, it's usually 3 years. And there's a reason, because it's very predictable, and you can amortize that depreciation over the 3-year period. There's a reason why they don't write leases for 1 month, because you could never price the risk accordingly, or people would have to pay $5,000 a month for the car. But we will continue to see innovation with leasing. In the US, Volvo has launched what they call a subscription. It's really a 2-year lease, that allows a consumer to pay all of their associated costs in one monthly payment. The vehicle payment and finance, the insurance for the vehicle, the warranty, and the roadside assistance all together. So they have a very predictable cost every month. And I think you'll see more of this. But these subscription services will be offered by the manufacturers, probably not third parties. Okay, let's get to some of the interesting areas. So let's talk about electrification. So I don't know where we are in Portugal today. I should have done my homework, but the US, we exited just under 10% of all new cars being plug-in electric in 2022. I saw a stat, I think in the Wall Street Journal this morning, that they say globally we had 10% of car sales were plug-in electrics last year. We hear, though, with Norway, they hit 70%, I believe, last year. So they're by far the leader. The US will be a laggard against Europe for some of the reasons that I'll talk about here. So consulting firms are forecasting in the US that we'll get to 50%, half of the cars, in the next 7 or 8 years by 2030 or 2032. I'm doubtful, and let me tell you why I'm doubtful. So when you ask consumers why they aren't buying EVs, cost aside, because by now EVs were supposed to be cheaper than comparable internal combustion engine vehicles. But China controls 80-90% of all the raw minerals that go into batteries. They made investments 15, 20 years ago. And as a result, I think we're going to have a hard time getting the cost of batteries down over time. Right now, something like 40% to 50% of the vehicle you buy is the battery itself. And I don't know that's going to come down over time. But I like to think of the reasons why consumers resist EVs as a triangle, 3 points on a triangle. And those are the range itself, the charging infrastructure availability, and then the time to charge. And if any of those three are reduced or optimized, then the resistance can start to collapse. If we can get production cars that can do 1,000 miles on one charge, if you can be certain that there's going to be chargers on every single corner and available chargers, and they're working, and the electrical grid isn't going to melt, and then finally, the time to charge. You can have less frequent chargers if you can charge a vehicle in 5 minutes. And there's a lot of innovation going on all three of those things. But until we see significant progress, I think there's still going to be a lot of resistance to EV adoption, specifically in the US, but I think also globally. But we continue to hear manufacturers proclaiming that they're going to go 100% EV. So how do we reconcile these two things? We don't know that the consumer is going to be ready for EVs, but we have CEOs of publicly traded automakers saying we're going to be 100% EV. And I believe it's really appeasing Wall Street. Because I can tell you this, if you're Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, she's 63 right now. By 2035, she will not be the CEO. So there'll be no accountability. And by 2030, 5 years from now, if all of a sudden, the demand isn't there, she won't be around to be accountable. And they can always backtrack and say, the consumer isn't ready. The consumer isn't ready. And I'll talk about the switch over to EVs because it's not an insignificant amount of money that they're spending. In fact, this came out in Reuters recently saying collectively the legacy automakers are spending more than $1 trillion to retool their plants. And if you're an automaker, how do you make those decisions in terms of timing? You don't want to be too early and retool all of your plants to EV before the consumer is ready, but you don't want to be too slow because we've seen, Honda and Toyota, for example, have to fast track now that EVs are gaining some momentum. So this is a big, huge billion-trillion-dollar bets on timing that's uncertain. But what we are going to see is, a doubling and a redoubling of the EV models hitting the market. So we'll get a sense pretty soon what natural demand from consumers are. My fear is that not every single one of these OEMs is going to be a shoo-shoo or a bonbon, right? So the challenge I think that will be we'll be producing EVs and they'll be turds, they'll be stinkers, right? They'll be what's the witches? Bruches. There'll be Bruches, many Bruches, many Bruches. So what happens then is that those cars can't find a home, and then the manufacturers have to come and provide incentives or sell them into a rental car fleet. It gets pretty ugly pretty quickly because we're going to see all of these new EVs hit the market, and there just won't be demand for all of them. That's what I believe. One more thing to note, and I'll come back to this, is that I've compared two vehicles, comparable vehicles. So up top is your EV, and below is your ICE vehicle, your combustion engine. And this is the service intervals by mileage for those cars. So remember this, the EV mechanically is a lot less complex. There's no oil to change, no spark plugs. So service intervals are very, very long. Now we're hearing for the first generation of these EVs, they have so many flaws and so many recalls. Because remember, these legacy automakers are figuring this out as they go, right? They're used to building internal combustion engine vehicles. The first EVs they build are going to be fraught with a lot of challenges. So the recalls are going to come back to dealers. But I think once they learn the competency of building EVs, you just won't see these cars as often at dealerships because they just aren't mechanically complex and don't need the regular service. So let's go to autonomy. If you had rolled back the clock 5 years and you listened to any of the consultants, by this point, half the cars on the road would be fully autonomous, driving themselves. You know, the Uber that I took over here wouldn't have a driver, and that would have blown up and destroyed a lot of consumer demand. Well, it didn't happen. And I can tell you this, I'm not young, but there will not be level 5 autonomous vehicles on the road in my lifetime. And I might die tomorrow. I might die on the plane ride home. But the difference really being level 4 is when you can take a nap in the back seat. Level 5 is when you can take a nap in the back seat in a snowstorm. And luckily you don't get snowstorms here in Lisbon, but a lot of the world does. So I believe this venture capital is correct. And the point is that how do these autonomous cars operate? They have cameras, LiDAR, or radar, all of which have lenses that have to stay clean. If those lenses get fogged up or have snow or salt or anything on them, the car will alert the driver, pull off to the side of the road, and say, you can take control. But how can the car give back control if there's no pedals and there's no steering wheel? So I think this is the problem. There are other philosophical problems with EVs that we could get into as well. But I think the main one is I don't think the technology can keep up. There's a reason why these level 5 EVs are tested in environments like Phoenix, Arizona, because it's sunny every day and there's never bad weather. So they have perfect weather to be able to test these things. Once they start testing these edge cases of bad weather, I think they're going to run into edge cases they can't satisfy, and there goes level 5. So that's for human cargo, right? Which is very precious. I think what we're seeing is for non-human cargo, autonomy is already here. So this is Hyundai. This is in a port, so unloading ships and moving cargo around. As long as there's not a human that can get run over by these things, they stay out of their way. These things are great. Robots can run the whole shipyard. This is interesting. We're about to see this on roads, both in Europe and in the US. There will be a driver in that truck, but there won't be drivers in the rest of the trucks. And one hint, don't try to get between them. Because these will be driving down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour, 130 kilometers an hour, and you'll see a driver in the first truck, but there won't be drivers in the rest of them. And it's going to greatly alleviate any strain there is on labor today, because we're going to find efficiencies. And these will be able to drive long distances, right, with no problem at all. There may even be dedicated lanes on highways, and it's an alternative to putting things on trains. But this is technology that's already being tested. And while I say you'll never see level 5 in my lifetime, you'll see this in the next year or so. You'll see this technology. You'll see small vehicles delivering non-human cargo to your house. So in this case, you pull out your phone with your QR code. You'll walk up to it and swipe that middle area. The door will open and you'll retrieve your groceries. So this is happening now. They're testing this in the US. They may be testing it in Europe as well. But you'll start to see this. And then, grandma in her walker will have to navigate around this thing, which will compete for sidewalk space, which is going to be interesting. And then you're seeing also Amazon and Walmart in the U.S. spending a lot of money and time on drones. And you may dismiss this, but the testing's already going on. For light packages, 1.5 kilograms or less, these drones will be able to drop these off at your home or your apartment complex. There'll be designated mailboxes for these things. And the interesting thing is that this will now allow us to have delivery within 10, 15, 20 minutes. Because by the time you buy the product on your app, they can dispatch that, attach that to a drone. The drone can be dispatched, and by the time you're done sending your order in, the product could literally be landing on your front doorstep. So it's a new world, and there's stories in the U.S. Being so gun happy that people are shooting these things down when they come across their yard. So I don't know how people are going to fight for the airspace over their yard, but it's hunting season, I guess, for drones. So two more, connectivity. So we get to some really interesting stuff here. So a year and a half ago, this article came out, and Tesla announced that they were going to remove the passenger seat lumbar support from the vehicle. And the reason is because 97% of cars never touch that option, never adjust the lumbar support. So the cars now have sensors. The manufacturers are collecting data from those sensors, and they can tell which buttons you push. So they can tell which months you use heated seats, how often you use cruise control, and they'll be able to start either removing content that is never used or charging consumers more for buttons that are pushed more often. If you're always likely to use heated seats during the month of January in Lisbon, they could charge you more for the feature on that month. So your cars are now aware. The manufacturers are collecting data off of your cars, and they'll be able to influence what they build, the configuration, and how they charge for those configurations. Mary Barra, a year ago, stood up at an investor conference and said, you can think of us as device makers. We're going to make the phone, but the real money is going to be selling software applications on top of the phone after we sell the device. So don't think of us as a device maker anymore. Think of us as a software company. And Wall Street analysts love the stuff, right? The stock shot up October of last year as a result. So what this means, though, is that not only are manufacturers having to retool their factories to transform to EVs, but now they're going to spend tens of billions of dollars building a software competency. And you're going to hear more about the software-defined vehicle, because everyone wants to be Tesla. Tesla started with the software and then built the car around it. We've got legacy automakers who are very competent at building cars. Now they have to suddenly leap forward and build a competency around software to be able to compete with Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, etc. And I think this spells something really, really bad in the future, because I believe automakers aren't going to be able to do both of these at the same time. So they can't possibly become competent around EVs and at the same time become software companies. So I think there will be tens of billions of dollars spent, and then we've seen this movie before. We'll find out 5 or 10 years from now, they'll have to write off those losses, and you'll find the automakers likely will be acquiring software companies, and won't be successful for the most part migrating to being software companies, because they're just not good at it. And by the way, they're going to be distracted by this transition to EVs at the very same time. So the legacy manufacturers, like I said with GM, are claiming that they're going to generate $20 to $30 billion each of new high margin revenue per year based on subscription products. So where are those going to come from? Well, Porsche has said in the future, consumers are going to be able to unlock another 50 horsepower for a monthly payment. We saw earlier this year, BMW got a lot of backlash when they said, for rear heated seats in Korea, you can either pay $1,000 up front or $18 a month. And there's a lot of pushback from consumers. We've heard of other manufacturers. Mercedes has said that they're going to allow consumers to unlock additional power, which is going to decrease the 0 to 100 kilometers time. So the manufacturers are now thinking about the efficiencies of building a lot of functionality and features into the car. And even if the consumer who buys that car initially doesn't unlock those features, they can later on come back to that consumer and try to convince them to pay a monthly fee to unlock a bunch of features. The big uncertainty is, will the OEMs, will the automakers share any of that revenue with the dealers? So if you're a dealer, many dealers in the room today, and you sell the consumer a Mercedes, and then 6 months later, that consumer elects to pay Mercedes some fee to unlock additional power, will you even be alerted that your customer unlocked some features? And what will the revenue share be back to that original dealer who may not even know that the consumer unlocked that feature? And I imagine the same thing's happening here in Europe, but in the US, negotiations are going on right now between the dealers and the manufacturer to negotiate the revenue share on these features as they get rolled out in the future. I think for the independent dealers in the audience, there's a great opportunity here because when you take that Mercedes in as a trade-in, that consumer is going to want an assurance that they're not going to be charged for that feature any longer. So you're going to have to wipe off all those enhanced features. But then when you demo the car, you allow the next consumer who comes in to test drive the car, you can upsell them all these fancy features. And I think in that case, it's likely that the independent dealer will have an opportunity to participate very richly in all that revenue share. But it's a new world, and you're going to need a much more sophisticated salesperson to be able to navigate around, hey, you can pay me extra for extra features. Let me demonstrate those features, and then collect the credit card to be able to charge them on a recurring base. So last thing, I know I'm a little bit over here. Over-the-air updates, which is very related. So again, to use Tesla as a good example. So 5 years ago, the Tesla Model 3 came out, and when it was reviewed, the reviewers gave it a very, very bad rank. They said, this car's braking is horrible. The braking is worse than a full-size pickup truck. And then Elon Musk, as his typical fashion, he gets angry. And 3 days later, he goes back and says, would you mind testing the car again? And they said, they resisted. They said, if we test the same car, we'll use the same methods, and we'll have the same results. And he said, no, please test the car again. They retested the car, and the braking from 100 kilometers to 0 shrunk by 20 feet. No technician touched the car. This is all through an over-the-air update via Wi-Fi. And this incident 5 years ago opened the eyes to all the other manufacturers to say, we've got to learn software. It's a new era we're entering. If we can push a software update to a car and change the driving dynamics of a vehicle, what else can we do? Which has germinated all these ideas about subscription services. So where are we now? Now we've got subscription services. In some cases, for some manufacturers, they're pretty ugly. They're not very efficient, but we're learning. One consulting firm in the US believes that 1/3 of all, or 33% of all warranty work is going to go away entirely with software updates. Consumers will no longer have to bring their vehicle in to get serviced for warranty work because we can change the dynamics of the car just through a software update. Another consulting firm, these are billions of dollars saved per year. So if you look at 2025, this consulting firm believes because of over-the-air OTA software updates, OEMs collectively are going to save $60 billion a year in warranty and recall avoidance. So there's huge cost savings in addition to all these subscription services. So the legacy automakers are seeing dollar signs. And remember, like I said earlier, the actual moving parts in an EV are much less than a comparable ICE vehicle. So if you look at over the lifetime ownership of that vehicle, there'll be about 40% fewer parts sold. So not only will dealers see fewer of these cars in for service, but you're also going to sell fewer parts because the cars themselves are going to become less complex. And Jose Munoz, the CEO of Hyundai, says that his rule of thumb is that these electric vehicles are only going to need about 1/3 or 33% of the service needs of a comparable internal combustion engine vehicle. One of the interesting things to observe is service defection. So in the US, and I imagine it's the same in Europe, the customers are fairly loyal. They bring their cars back for service for the duration of the warranty period, which is usually like 3 years, 30,000 miles, 50,000 kilometers. But at the end of the warranty period, consumers in the US are no longer very loyal. They take their vehicles to an independent repair shop. I think what we're going to see is a flattening of this curve. So because the cars are going to be so complex and they're going to need specialized technician skill and specialized tools to work on them, very likely the loyalty back to the franchise dealer network is going to be a lot higher. So everything that I said about EVs having longer service intervals, being less complex, is true, but I think over the lifetime of that vehicle's ownership, that consumer is going to be much more loyal to bringing the car back to a franchise dealer. So you might get more money from the consumer over their entire lifetime, just it's going to take a lot longer to get that money out of the consumer. And then this is disrupting the independent repair shops, as you can imagine, because will they have the technician skill and the tools to be able to work on these vehicles? So finally, let's wrap it all up before Nuno grabs me off stage here. So let's talk about the future. So there are all of these different trends, and it's hard for me to stay up to date on these trends. And I think it's hard for all of us to stay up to date on these trends and understand which ones we should be paying attention to and which ones are going to have the biggest effect on our business. Pre-COVID-19, we did see in the US what we called margin compression. Every year, the profit margin for dealers as a percentage of all revenue was slowly coming down. A lot of this was driven through transparency. Consumers had better information about pricing on both new and used vehicles. They knew the price for their trade-in. They knew the price that they wanted to pay for the car, and they could prove it. And the salesperson had a harder time negotiating with the consumer overall. I don't think that we're going to see a comet coming for the earth and it's going to blow up the dealer network, and largely because of this. I liken the operation of a dealership to be like squeezing a water-filled balloon. And if you've ever squeezed a water-filled balloon, you push on one area and it pops out another area. You push on one area, it pops out another area. And the beautiful thing about the dealership model is you aren't just running one operation within a dealership. Under the rooftop of a dealership, you can have 3 up to 10 different operations. You can have service and parts. You can have used car operations. You can have new car operations. You can have financing of vehicles. You can sell insurance products. You can sell parts and accessories. And some dealers even have collision repair shops as well attached. In the US, it's about a third of dealers. But the nice thing is that as pressures mount on certain areas, certain departments within the dealers have always been able to reallocate people, resources, and money to different departments to maintain profitability. And this is one of the most resilient things about the franchise dealer model. So I would say practical advice is every dealer I've ever met is in a 30-day cycle. They're very focused on hitting sales targets for one individual month. And it may be different in Portugal, but I'm willing to bet most of your operators are focused on hitting their numbers by the end of the month. And then it resets at the beginning of the next month, and then they're off to the races again. It's a new month, and they're trying to hit sales targets for that month, financial targets. And I think we collectively have to look at the horizon, take our heads out of that operations, look at the horizon, and look at all of these trends. So what I would recommend as I part is this. So take a very standard risk matrix, where on this axis you look at, for any of these risks, any of these trends, you look at the probability. Is it absolutely going to happen, or is there zero chance of it happening? And then if that risk happens, what's the impact financially to your business? Is it minor, or is it significant? And if you take all those trends and you map them, I took my attempt, but you should do this with your leadership. Look at all these trends, just map them probability to significance, and anything in green you don't need to worry about, because either it has a low probability of occurring, or the impact is going to be very minor on your operations. Anything that has a high probability of happening and will have a significant financial impact on your business, Those are the few things you need to be paying attention to, build a strategic roadmap around, and prepare for. I believe it's these things, and I'll get you this presentation. I believe these are the 8 things that dealers should particularly be paying attention to right now, because they do have a high probability of occurring and have a significant financial impact. And that's it. I would say that if you're interested in this kind of information, we do publish a weekly newsletter that's for free. I apologize, it is in English. But if you want that, you can go to automotiveventures.com. And then we also are investing in early stage companies. So if you're interested in investing in early stage companies in the mobility and automotive space globally, we do have an investment club. There's no cost to join, and we'll send you investments every month. And if you're ever interested in any of them, you can reach out to me to learn more. So with that, that's everything I have here. I think